So this is the first edition of the Khoodeelaar television channel. Khoodeelaar is spelled, as you can see on the banner, KhoodeelaarTV channel. And this is the edition. Whatever it says on the ticker, this is part A. And we're doing the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street with a difference. This is the only paper, the Financial Times from Fleet Street, that we are actually looking at. And this is simple because we don't believe that we need to look at the actual texts of the Fleet Street papers to know what they're doing. In terms of the domestic consumption, which is what the England-centric Little English mentality dominating the contents, the editorial, the style, the manner, the framework, everything. And Fleet Street, based on its role in peddling lies to the public, most of the public are English, and a lot of them are believers in the concept of Little England. And as we have said, Little England to the Little English is the center of the earth. There is nothing bigger than Little England. You decide on the contradictions inherent in that mentality. And we shall come to some of the topical contradictions and immoralities and lying. Little England, in the context of the idea of justice for Geronimo, has behaved with typical immorality, typical lack of ethics, typical lack of engagement with evidence. For 4 years, the UK central government department called DEFRA, which is the Department for supposedly environment, etc., that covers in its kind of reference, remit, all the aspects of the lives of animals like Geronimo. And Geronimo, we are maintaining the campaign Justice for Geronimo. That is one of the slogans. Justice for Geronimo, Save Geronimo, and similar statements that are actually based on the evidence of the last 4 years. Now, who am I? Some of the people who come across this broadcast, may wonder, who is this guy in terms of the contents and the role and the impact and the agenda of Fleet Street. And these people may include some who still believe that the newspapers like the Daily Mail, like the Sun, the Daily Express, daily bribing Boris Graph, also known as Daily Telegraph, and the later kind of arrival from Manchester, the Guardian, which used to be called the Manchester Guardian, and is misleadingly running the kind of claim that it has been in existence for 200 years. Now, it doesn't say that it hasn't existed in London. It was mainly the Manchester Guardian. We shall come to discuss the kind of difference in terms of the contents. Now, who am I? I am more experienced in media, in the law, in the practice and application of the law, constitutional law, than anyone you can find in Fleet Street. That's the basic information. You don't need to know the kind of CB, chronological kind of engagements. Suffice to say that there is no one who has spent more time, more intellect, if you like, intellectual engagement in finding out, looking for the contents of the what is called the Fleet Street newspapers and others. So when I say that I'm doing the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street, I'm not kidding. I'm actually going by the contents, the evidence of the role of the titles over the last 200 years, 300 years, whatever. It's not 300 years yet, but it's over 200 years. The Fleet Street newspapers have been in existence and have been in circulation. Not all of them. The one that is actually the longest running is, of course, the Times. But the Times, which used to boast as being the newspaper of record or records, has long ceased to be the newspaper of record or records. Not because it doesn't record news, of course it does, but the morality, the ethics, the neutrality, and the strength of moral purpose, accountability for society by the executive, by the power holders. That rigor has long left the Times, if it ever had that rigor consistently. I mean, the Times, as I have said before, not in this edition, the Times is the newspaper that actually printed a shameless boast after the death of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, without any reason as to why the Times suppressed Solzhenitsyn's contribution while he was alive and was active against the authoritarian, fascistic environment that he was fighting against in the former USSR. Effectively, Solzhenitsyn was the leading, or one of the most effective, outspoken opponents and critics, diarists, journalists actually, about what Stalinism was doing to the people in the USSR. And Solzhenitsyn's contribution, communications to the Times were contemporaneous to the Stalinist regime still persisting in the USSR, which was the time that the West, meaning the UK, NATO, the USA, of course, were engaged in the Cold War, which was to kind of show up, expose, draw attention to what is going on in the Stalinist kind of regime, whatever the kind of name of the head of the regime was. And whatever kind of structural changes were brought about in the 1980s to the USSR actually resulted from the work of the likes of Solzhenitsyn, which work in the singular and the plural, if you like, was or were highly promoted and publicized by the Western propaganda operations that were engaged in the Cold War. So the Times is that stupid, that dishonest, and that corrupt, and that idiotic. It suppressed Solzhenitsyn's contribution. And to this day, after Solzhenitsyn passed away, I cannot find any evidence of why that could be justified. And yet, the Times remains, if you like, on the shelves and in circulation, partly because of the pornographic income that the scum and other outlets generate for dirty digger Rupert Murdoch. And Murdoch subsidizes the Times because most of the so-called contributors given platforms on the Times are, of course, peddling the theme of perpetuating ideologically the pack of denials and undemocratic, anti-democratic facade of free speech and free opinion. There is no justice in what the Times does. And Geronimo has not been given a just platform by the Times or the rest of history. Now, today, we are beginning a phase where we shall not be buying Fleet Street newspapers. And this one, Financial Times, there is a reason why we have bought it. Now, the reason why we shall not be buying Fleet Street newspapers to do the review or diagnosis of Fleet Street is because there is nothing there in the contents. And Geronimo defines the emptiness, the moral bankruptcy and ethical kind of corruption by, in, through, via the Fleet Street papers. Every time the Fleet Street titles have allegedly carried any news report about Geronimo, they have lied, they have repeated, and they have stated the lies against Geronimo issued by the DEFRA, the central government department in the UK, and also by other departments of the UK. The DEFRA is the one that has been the perpetrator of the lying, defamation, slander, and libel of Geronimo's mom, Helen MacDonald. And they have always mentioned her as an afterthought. After repeating the DEFRA lies against Geronimo, all the newspaper reports then add Helen's disagreement with the DEFRA lies as an afterthought, as a kind of footnote. Now, for 4 years, Helen has been the main kind of party that has challenged the serial lies of DEFRA about the state of Geronimo's health, the quality of Geronimo's health, the impact of Geronimo's health. Now, as far as I know there is no other case, that is to say, there is no other story similar to this, and I have not come across any similar story. Now, when I say I, meaning I am the consumer of newspaper titles, I am the only consumer on the face of the earth that I know of who has bought most print newspaper titles every day for decades. This is one way. Looking at the papers, the contents of the paper, the bias of the papers, and the omissions, what they leave out, and the corruption of the papers. One way of looking at what the people who hold the positions in power at the expense of what remains of society. Because remember, what we are looking at, these people have been in power since May 2010. So 2000 is 11 years plus few months. 11 years and 3 months. And one day, let's say, or just under 3 months, if we count the date in May 2010. So these people are believers in the gospel of evil. What do? They don't believe in society, because Margaret Thatcher, whom they worship effectively, and she was not something at all, anything to do with the deity, because people who knew about the impact of her policies were accused of being kind of immoral when some of them danced in the streets and chanted, "The beach is dead," they said. We didn't. Our campaign never did any such thing. But that is a fact. So there were people in the demography, in the population in this country, who thought like that about Margaret Thatcher. And Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. And the utterances of these people who have been in posts since May 2010 are repetitions of many of the things like that Margaret Thatcher said. There is no such thing as society. She might have added, there is no such thing as justice. Because for 4 years, these people who worship Margaret Thatcher have been in denial of the truth about Geronimo. Now, we didn't know about Geronimo in the sense of being an issue or a campaign featured in the newspapers, because although we knew later, after Helen MacDonald issued the information to the public in the way that she did in let's say, mainly in August 2021. And in the contents of what she has released are references to all the communications and battles that she had been fighting for justice, vindication for Geronimo. Our campaign has not been involved until August, I think, when we read the stuff and we read the evidence. And it was obvious that we had to join the campaign for justice for Geronimo. Once we became involved, other issues became apparent to us. I'll come to that section in a minute. Now, the Financial Times yesterday, that is Tuesday, the 31st of August, ran a piece by a former BBC Newsnight policy editor named as Chris Cook. Now, we have, as at this time, no evidence as to what that piece did to DEFRA. Because unlike any of the other papers in Fleet Street or anywhere else, any broadcasting or radio platform in this country or anywhere else in the world that has been carrying content about Geronimo, none of those had any piece similar to what Chris Cook's piece yesterday was. And Chris Cook's piece yesterday, as I said, in my knowledge, is the first one published or broadcast or aired in any mainstream media in this country or a media from any other part of the world that actually referred to what goes on inside the UK government departments. Now, those people who are watching this, or those people who don't actually know about Britain from living in the UK, may or may not be familiar with the phrase civil servant. In most of the countries in the world, they are clerks, they are called clerks. They are not called civil. These are people who are not employed by the military, the defense services. These are people that are actually employed in various UK central government departments, so-called. Now, this broadcast, this program, and this campaign, this movement originally uses various phrases like so-called, not because we are not sure about the kind of described identities of these departments, but we want to point out that underneath the names, these departments actually don't deliver the service that the names imply. Similarly, civil servants are neither civil nor do they provide service. And that's what Chris Cook of the Financial Times mentioned, not in the way that I'm mentioning, but Chris Cook's piece was headed that civil servants is control officials. Either officials or civil servants in the UK are making every effort to keep official secrets secret. Now, that is contrary to the provisions of the so-called Freedom of Information Act. Remember, I'm saying so-called. It will become very clear immediately. Because the Freedom of Information Act that still exists in the UK statute book, so-called, was a reluctant piece of legislation. But under the provisions of the most widely referred to aspects of the Act, civilians, members of the public, are entitled to apply for freedom of information concerning government departments, concerning public bodies. And Chris Cook, in his piece, acknowledges that although that is the case, there are too many obstructions built in the Freedom of Information Act to deny the requester most of the important information they apply for. And in that context, Chris Cook says that he applied for a very small amount of information from the Treasury, that is the Finance Department of the UK government, back in 2007. Notice the year 2007. And the first formal reply, or the first factual reply to that request, he didn't get in 2007. He didn't get in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. He only got the first response or reply in May, I think, this year, 2021. So it's 18, 19, 20, 21, 4 years. Now the 4 years from 2017 to 2021 are parallel to the 4 years over which the DEFRA department has issued dozens and dozens and dozens of denials and lies against Geronimo. Of course, the two things are different because Chris Cook wasn't in any way, as far as his piece yesterday shows, looking for any information about DEFRA, any information what DEFRA was doing against Geronimo's rights and Helen MacDonald's applications. So Chris Cook later tweeted in his Twitter account that that piece yesterday was his first piece for the Financial Times, or printed in the Financial Times, since he returned to the Financial Times after a spell at the BBC Newsnight, and he returned as the senior reporter, or as a senior reporter at the Financial Times. So we don't know at this stage, because we are not in contact with anybody that has any direct communication with anyone on behalf of Geronimo. All we know is what is publicly kind of posted and accessible. So we don't know what contact or what contents of what contracts people campaigning for Geronimo have had about any aspect of the contents of the Financial Times. But it is very significant what the Financial Times says. We have already posted the image of the article by Chris Cook, and we have highlighted one or two aspects in a later kind of post yesterday. We didn't do any broadcast of this program yesterday. So what we are doing now is saying that we don't need to look at the Fleet Street papers because they have not told the truth about the government's behavior against Geronimo, and they have not told the truth about the government's conduct generally to the public. Now, in the full piece that Chris Cook has written about the officials, government officials, making it difficult for the public to get access under Freedom of Information Act. He or his piece is the first one that we have seen in any Fleet Street paper or any British paper that refers to various aspects of the government's departments or departmental behavior that are very significantly, ironically, coincidentally, however you want to put it, on the evidence, they're pointers to what Geronimo has been subjected to and how Helen has been treated by the DEFRA department and the other departments she may or may not have actually been in contact with, because we don't know. We haven't had any direct kind of access to what she has actually done in full. We can only access what she has published so far in the last few weeks. But we don't know those that cannot be reproduced, let's say phone calls or personal kind of conversations that she may or may not have had with any of those people. And it is up to Helen to confirm, either by publicly or by direct message or communications to us, the extent and the actual reality of what she has encountered, come across. Not encountered in the sense that the phrase is used or the word is, concept is used in most of Indian cinema. In Indian cinema, encounter is that word or concept that is used to mean the Indian police shooting dead or murdering a person they had in custody or had confrontation with. Now, the things that Chris Cook talks about are the Secrets Act and the way the elaborate extent to which the civil servants, the clerks, go to hide information, make up information. And he refers to the Cabinet Office. Now, the Cabinet Office is probably the most widely referred to part of the formal description of the incumbent in the post of Prime Minister in the name of UK. And so therefore it is a department which contains the Cabinet Secretary, which is the, in terms of administration, the most powerful among the clerks. De facto kind of leader of the clerk service. There are thousands of, quote, civil servants. And Chris Cook says about the Cabinet Office controlling and influencing the release or the lack of release of information under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, all the court cases, the latest one being in the middle of August, that Geronimo has had through Helen and her, quote, legal team, have effectively sought the evidence of what DEFRA knew about various regimes, various tests that were supposedly being carried out to supposedly establish the extent, the fact and the extent of the illness that a particular animal carried or didn't carry. And what the Financial Times article by Chris Cook refers to is significant also because this is the only paper that has done that. And looking at today's papers, there is no follow-up. There is no follow-up to Chris Cook's piece, and there is no, I'll check again, there is no letter in the letters page from the UK central government clerks referring to what Chris Cook has said. Anyone watching this edition needs to know that this is being broadcast at our own expense. That is, we fund all of this, and the source of funding is based on our own raising the fund privately. We don't seek public funding. We have not done that ever in decades of communications and movements. All right, so there are these letters that I shall read the headlines of in order to make it very clear that the piece by Chris Cook has not been followed up by any letter from the central government department either. So this is one. The first letter is the West requires a whole nation approach to cyber security. So that's not about Defra or Geronimo. And there is the other letter, Campaign Group Defense Assisted Dying. And then the other letter is World Leaders Urge to Boost Vaccine Availability. This is a letter from a number of people about vaccine. An incoherent planning system is in need of reform. It's about it's from a solicitor's company person. Company is Pinsent Masons in the city of London. The person who wrote it is Robbie Owen. And the next letter underneath that is creating office avatars is much like climbing Everest. And it says, in response to Hannah Murphy's article, Avatar Star in Facebook's version of The Office, 20th of August, why do people climb Mount Everest? Because it's there and they can. Why do computer scientists create virtual meeting systems? Because it's possible and they can. Neither do anything other than justifying admiration for their skills and tenacity in reaching their objective. Neither do anything for humanity. Now that's Stuart Miller, Arlington, Virginia, USA. Now this is something absolutely true. In our view, Mount Everest or other Everests must never be mounted or interfered with. That they're destroying the climate, they're destroying the Earth's surface. So we agree with that one. There is another letter which is HS2 is hard sell even to the most naive pension fund. Now this is the nearest in the letters that anyone comes to the behavior of the UK bureaucracy, central government bureaucracy, because HS2 is to date the biggest waste of public resource. That's our view, but let's see what this one is saying. The last paragraph, with an estimated benefit to cost ratio of around 0.5% even before these latest changes, the Treasury, that is the UK Department of Finance, might have a job selling this government-backed white elephant to even the most naive pension fund. Compare this with the net cost of closing it down of around 7 billion. And HS2 is estimated to be over 150 billion, some 10 times the original estimate. Now, this is the crux of the disconnect between the civil service and the public and society. Now, 150 billion is way too much to waste. In an economy, in a population where a third of the people in this country are in low income and in poverty of one sort or another. And I'm not going to list the details of the other failures that society is inflicted with. And this is common sense. White elephant is something that is waste, symbol of waste, public waste. So the behavior of the treasury clerks, if you like, who persist in funding HS2 wastes is not accountable or held to account or accountability. And the Chris Cook piece in the Financial Times on Tuesday, the 31st of August, 2021, is a light-hearted piece, despite the fact that the issue and the subject and the problems that he refers to or he highlights are very grave indeed. Because without accountability, there is no justice. And without honesty, there is no justice. And Geronimo has been denied accountability and justice and the truth, as has his mom, Helen. In the course of our coverage, we have coverage that is in support of the campaign, various statements that we have made. We have referred to the judgment published again in 2017. Remember, it's the year 2017 that Geronimo arrived in the UK from his country of birth, New Zealand. And it's the 2017 to 2021, these 4 years we are talking about. Both Chris Cook's piece covers the same 4 years, and the judgment officially published by the UK Supreme Court on the 17th of January 2017 was the case called Belhaj and another against Straw and another. Now, Belhaj is the Libyan opposition activist opposing Gaddafi at the time, who more than 15, 16 years ago, when Tony Blair was imposed as Prime Minister Tony Blair was wooing, bribing in terms of the praise, and Gaddafi was being wooed by Blair for funds and support. So in order to appease Gaddafi, or part of the appeasement of Gaddafi, the UK allowed the abduction of Belhaj and his wife from countries in the southeast in Asia. And they were brought to Libya by the CIA with the knowledge of the UK, and they were tortured, both of them, Belhaj and his wife. So that's the case we have been referring to, because the ruling contains a reference to the Magna Carta, 1225, in which justice is in effect recognized. And this is a ruling that was about torture and the UK's complicity with torture by the CIA and the Americans. And during the various interviews that Helen MacDonald has given to Fleet Street, she has included the term torture. She said that she felt, in the last 4 years, she felt that she had been tortured. Elsewhere, she said that she feels that she has been punished. Both of those are against the pledge, the undertaking given 800 years ago in the Magna Carta to the citizen. So Helen's feeling that she was tortured is very real. Her feeling that she had been punished are real, which is what the Chris Cook piece in the Financial Times actually, in effect, refers to and covers. Because if her request, turned down by the, quote, High Court judges, if her request was granted for access to material evidence, information that DEFRA had about the relevant aspects of their behavior, about detecting, about checking animals about health, she would not have spent 4 years. And in a post yesterday, 31st of August 2021, Helen says that that's the first time she had got a reply. Just like Chris Cook said that he applied for information in 2017 and he got the first reply in May this year. Now, in his book about the rise of fascism in Britain, the book that is a recent release, Paul Mason, who for a time worked on the BBC television, and his Twitter handle is called Paul Mason News. So anyone who wants to check can check by contacting him through the Twitter. Paul Mason has said that fascism is not happening in Britain in a kind of wild way, but it is happening with most of the people not being even aware that this is happening. So what the DEFRA treatment of Helen MacDonald shows is that it has been in breach of the Magna Carta, in breach of the Freedom of Information Act, and breach of most of the statutes, that is, acts of parliament that the UK passed. And yet, Fleet Street never mentioned any of that. Never once mentioned any of those illegalities, those breaches. I mean, one of the most extraordinary breaches of UK law is the repeated perpetuation of libel, defamation of Helen MacDonald. Because in effect, they have called her a liar. She has been the one that has been asking for the truth. Yet she has been repeatedly called a liar. And this is in breach of the 2013 Defamation Act. In one particular, that Defamation Act 2013 says that a person is guilty of defamation if the person defamed, like Helen MacDonald, has been caused actual material damages and loss or potential loss. And if anything, Helen MacDonald has been the victim of an attack, a series of attacks, defamatory attacks that have directly caused her losses. So when we have been talking about the need for we have been saying that there have been legal options. We've been saying in public, not necessarily in any kind of direct messages to Helen, but we have been posting with the spirit of sharing the information, the expertise, the wisdom, the insight with all other genuine supporters of Geronimo. Justice for Geronimo, so that they know what we have been making publicly available in terms of the options. And we have said that although Helen has been represented in court cases by licensed law traders, at least in 3 most notable cases, the evidence shows that those are only 3 cases. There have been opportunities or options and scope in terms of evidence to mount many legal claims, court-based claims. Now here is an insight into how, quote, the law can be used as a directly productive political tool. There are 2 definitions of the law. One is the phrase written law. Who made that phrase famous? It's a woman called Fawn Hall. Now, Fawn Hall was the private assistant to Oliver North, Colonel Oliver North in the USA Army. And Colonel Oliver North was the one that was involved in the scandal during Ronald Reagan's regime as president with the Iran-Contra scandal. Very much like the duplicity and the contradictions and the dishonesty that the British media, Fleet Street, dishonestly peddles the UK government's, quote, alleged stance on the Taliban, or the UK government's alleged stance on many so-called Islamic terrorists. They never tell the truth about the Fleet Street never tells the public the truth about the extent, the fact and the extent of actual dealings between the UK government and these supposed enemies that publicly get portrayed as the enemies of the people of Britain. That is never the case. That is never the truth. As was highlighted during Iran-Contra scandal. Iran-Contra scandal involved the USA government having dealings with the hated Iranian regime via a South American country. Iran-Contra, the Contra is a South American kind of country outfit. And Oliver North, Colonel Oliver North, was the Ronald Reagan regime's intermediary or go-between Iran and the country in Latin America. So Fawn Hall, his PA, was brought before the US Congress to give testimony. And one of the things that she was involved in doing was shredding of vital documents in the Oliver North operation. She shredded them. That is how she featured in the proceedings. Now, remember what Ronald Reagan was famous for. One of the things that Ronald Reagan was very famous for was describing Iran and North Korea as the Looney Tunes. That is, in his public condemnation, Iran was out of bounds. Iran was completely out of the, if you like, realms of civilization, as was North Korea at the time when Reagan was saying the Looney Tunes. Now that was the Iran that the same Reagan was in business with in private. So this week's news, or the last week's news, carried by Fleet Street and the BBC and others in the UK, about Afghanistan include increasing indications, ascending, going up, mounting, increasing references to the Taliban as almost the good guys. Almost the good guys. Against whom? Of course, it is the other lot coming after Afghanistan, which is the, according to the contents in the British media, or contents propagated through the British media, Fleet Street, a kind of breakaway version of the ISIS. So what will happen in the coming weeks, months, years is that the West, including the USA, of course, will build up relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, while they do that, they will also work to create another organization that can counter the Taliban in due course. And that organization or that outfit, that alternative, would welcome British business and business with Britain. What all of this is showing is that there is no justice in any of this. Because the people who have been featuring in the Fleet Street newspapers or Fleet Street media and the BBC and the Sky News, etc., in the last, let's say, 2 weeks, as being evacuated or rescued out of Afghanistan are not native Afghans in the main. The native Afghans in numbers have been very small, and they have only been rescued or included in the rescue by the USA and by the UK, two of the main occupants, because it would completely upset USA state and UK state interests if those particular Afghans were left behind. But in the main, the overwhelming majority of the people rescued out of Afghanistan have been non-Afghan US people, UK people. So despite the various expressions of plastic expressions of regret at leaving those people behind, these plastic expressions attributed to Boris Johnson, the main people rescued from out of Afghanistan have been the British natives or British nationals. Same thing with the USA nationals. No equal rights there. No recognition of equal humanity. No recognition of the human rights of the people who are being left exposed to be massacred by the Taliban, which is what the line explaining the rescue of the British nationals and the American nationals has been. Despite the fact that later the Taliban were being used by the fleeing British and American kind of personnel and forces. The Taliban were being used to stall and stop the ISIS or whatever. And the row between an ex-British Marine called Pen Farding and the British Defence Ministry, fronted by Ben Wallace, over the obstruction that Ben Wallace created against the rescue of the dogs and cats that were at the shelter or shelters created and run by or ran under the direction of Ben Farding in a place called Nawzat in Afghanistan. That row actually shows the injustice to the animals. Because Wallace said that he was not going to prioritize animals over people, or even to kind of treat animals as equal to people. That now shows that the media role has been to just kind of overhype the raw aspect rather than focus on the rights of those exposed to danger and being left behind. That was the row about. That was what Penfarthing was concerned about. And he had the support of, quote, likes of Ricky Gervais or Jarvis, who put a tweet in his Twitter account, quote, "Dear stupid," see, in a 4-letter word, 5-letter word in the plural. And he was supporting Penfarthing. And he was saying, J.K. Jarvis, that the animals rescued don't even get to travel in comfort as human beings do, because they are put in the most uncomfortable parts of the aircraft, which they have to put up with. Now that's the evidence. And the papers, the media, did not give the truthful coverage about animal rights and welfare. And they didn't give truthful account of the carers of the animals, just as they've never really given the truthful account of Helen, Geronimo's mom. So what the piece by Chris Cook does is leave out most of the defects in the rest of the state, and Chris Cook has not himself acknowledged the constitutional law context in the international kind of sphere or domain that the UK is situated in. Now, regardless of what political party or color is in place, and there has been only one for the last 11 years continuously, essentially it has been the conservatives of the right-wing kind of variety. Because of that, there has been Brexit. Because contrary to his kind of dishonest pretensions, Cameron too wanted to pander to the Little Englanders, isolationists, who didn't want international framework of law. Our concern about Brexit was not about the majority of what Nigel Farage and others were campaigning for. Our concern was about the absolutely unavoidable loss to ordinary people in Britain, who would lose the option to seek redress, to genuinely seek redress, to excessively seek redress against their local council, their local regional authority like the Greater London Assembly or their central government departments collectively in the context of the general doctrine of separation of powers called the executive. The executive is the government, not the parliament, but the government. And the local council in each locality is run by or controlled by the local council clerks, clerical people, not by the elected councillors. Shall come to that in due course. Now, what Fawn Hall did was never, she never was really held to account. And what Chris Cook is saying in his piece is that no matter what the clerks, the civil servants, breach the requirements of the domestic UK law, the Freedom of Information Act, they get away. They're not held to account. And Chris Cook names one individual, one, quote, civil servant, quote, sir something, who was actually mentioned in relation to the statement by one judge. In a rare case, Chris Cook didn't distinguish the rarity and the ordinariness of cases, because most of the behavior of the UK central government departments are allowed to remain without scrutiny, proper, legal, rigorous scrutiny by an independent court action. So this guy was mentioned. And Chris Cook also mentioned that even if they break the laws, break the rules, and in effect behave dishonestly, there is nothing. There is no outrage. He uses the word there is no outrage. Now, Chris Cook is a very laid back individual. I have, strictly for evidence, I have had to observe his very rare appearances on camera in some of the broadcast items on Newsnight. He's very laid back and he's not somebody that can be in any way described as a campaigner, let's say. Okay, so today's Financial Times, on the same page underneath the letters column, is another notebook item. Notebook was the title that Chris Cook's piece appeared under. And this notebook is by somebody called Sebastian Payne. And Sebastian Payne's piece, notebook, is headed, Britain needs to find a better role for its former prime ministers. That's the Sebastian Payne piece. And the last paragraph is completely typical peddling. Sebastian Payne writes, it's easy to imagine how much richer the debate over Brexit would have been if Blair, Brown, and Cameron had been present on the green benches. The dilemmas facing the country now, coronavirus, regional inequalities, and climate change, are no less serious, and British politics is sorely missing leaders with wisdom and expertise. Our ex-prime ministers have both. Now, that is the last paragraph by Sebastian Payne writing his notebook. But before that paragraph, he peddles Tony Blair. He says Blair hankers for the Commons. His allies say he would love to return to frontline politics, but for the harsh reality of standing for Parliament. One says, if Tony had found a way to stay in the Commons, the last decade of Labour and national politics would have looked very different. Now, this is Sebastian Payne is writing as a right winger because he is actually in denial about the disastrous role each one of the ones that he praises there, Blair, Brown, and Cameron, has played. But what is even more dangerous is the fact that both Payne and Chris Cook yesterday don't refer to the real crisis, which is the crisis of democracy. The threat by fascism that Paul Mason has been writing about. And the lack of democracy is at the root of the lack of honesty and the lack of accountability and the lack of any willingness by the clerks, also known as the civil servants, to disclose information to the public, even under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, this is in the wider context of what Paul Mason has been saying. This is the state just about the slow walking stage of fascism. There is no accountability. And as the people protesting against the abuse of state power under the coronavirus measures, as the people have said, this is fascistic. Not the actual content of any relevant preventative medicine, like the vaccines or whatever, but the way that people are being penalized, whereas the likes of ministers, governments, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, etc., are allowed exemption, which the ordinary people are not allowed. So, although Chris Cook writes a heading, the heading says, I'm coming to that in a minute. Let's see what Chris Cook's heading was yesterday. All right, so his heading in the piece that was in the actual print edition of the Financial Times in the UK, because it is the print edition is printed various parts of the world, but the UK edition is what we are referring to. So the headline read, it was an opinion piece, UK officials are going to great lengths to keep their secrets secret. And he says the Freedom of Information Act is being quietly gutted by civil servants. Burnt. So what he's saying is the UK central government is allowing its employees to systematically, openly, rampantly break the existing Act of Parliament. Now, this is very topical because the newspapers, in misreporting Helen MacDonald's fight for justice for Geronimo, the newspapers have not done justice to this fact that DEFRA's behavior in denying Helen MacDonald all the information she has been entitled to, Geronimo has been entitled to under the existing Freedom of Information Act. That is the government breaking the law. And the Fleet Street papers haven't come anywhere near that. And I'm here not even examining Dominic Lai's son and his attacks on Geronimo and the Ian Pissoff, who fronts the private lie. Because Pissoff's private lie repeated the DEFRA lies against Geronimo and against Helen MacDonald and lied about the state of health of Geronimo. It is not a joke. Yet Private Lie wrote this as a joke. Geronimo has been embattled against the lies, obstructions, denials, falsehood, untruths by DEFRA for 4 years. Geronimo is healthy, alive, and absolutely innocent. That is at stake, and that is what Paul Mason, when he says that fascism is arriving in a form people don't realize, that is the kind of case he's referring to. But the Financial Times piece does acknowledge only part of it. It doesn't go into enough detail, enough depth. And the fact that the second day's notebook is by Sebastian Payne, who is making a propaganda claim for ex-prime ministers, is not a straightforward promotion of ex-prime ministers. It's actually an indirect criticism, a condemnation of Boris Johnson and Theresa May. And this promotion for ex-prime ministers by Sebastian Payne also, and it must be the editorial decision by the Financial Times, quite apart from the fact that Sebastian Payne personally is not a very bright boy. Sebastian Payne is doing this by staying far away from the anti-democratic, fascistic, lack of accountability and lack of justice that dominate society, as controlled, if you like, or influenced by elected post holders, with the army, literally the army of unelected people who not only have no respect for civil liberties, but are defiantly in denial of civil society. And that's because the role being played by the so-called shadow cabinet is crucial here, which is something that Sebastian Payne doesn't discuss. He couldn't discuss it, because if he discussed that, the role of the shadow cabinet or the shadow prime minister, let's say, then he would not be able to peddle Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or David Cameron. And what is happening with the absence of references to the positive, that is to say, what they are doing? Not positive in the sense of the tests for tuberculosis, positive in the sense of what is going on, as opposed to normative, that is what should go on, etc. So what is going on in the name of government, as, quote, fronted and led by Boris Johnson, is continuation under Johnson's name of what Chris Cook is talking about. That the Freedom of Information Act is being gutted, and that's only a little sign, tip of the iceberg of the bigger thing. And here is the list of the bigger things that are happening. When Keir Starmer, here is a footnote about constitutional law. The UK constitution normally is referred to as a country with no written constitution. Now that is a misleading statement to begin with. But even if there were a written constitution, a volume called the Constitution, the contents would not serve the cause, the purpose of democracy, the purpose of democratic accountability. How? Here is how. Because the claim, as I said, misleading, that there is no written British constitution, because there are far too many acts of parliament that are collectively referred to as the statute book, although there is not one statute book as such, but collectively, notionally, all the acts of parliament constitute that part or those parts of the, quote, constitution that is supposed to be not written. So that's number one. So that fact is not correct to say that there is no written constitution, because there are written acts of parliament, written statutes. But if you look into the contents of the written acts of parliament, then you can, if you look cleverly and if you look intelligently and if you look in context, with an open mind and with enlightened background in your perspective and outlook, then you can immediately spot with ease the corruption of most of the acts of parliament, the corruption in most of the acts of parliament. Here is a international framework-based explanation. For example, when it was the European Convention for Human Rights, or so-called, various aspects of the main convention had to be acknowledged by a domestic Human Rights Act, which is the Human Rights Act 1998. But then you come across in there a lot of derogation. Now, derogation is an instrument that actually gives the domestic member country, let's say, too much leverage, too much excuses to behave in conflict with the very contents of the particular act of parliament, say the Human Rights Act. Because it says that if something like terrorism or national security are involved in an application of a provision of the act, let's say the Human Rights Act, then the domestic country can ignore the Human Rights Act. And there are too many articles in the original European Convention that the UK can avoid, can ignore. That there, and then in the contents of the Human Rights Act. Now, why is this such an important issue? Because if the main purpose, the main kind of provision, the main protection, human rights protection, are the subject of the case, court case against the government, against the state. Say in the case of Geronimo, if it is the DEFRA behavior violating the Human Rights Act, the Freedom of Information Act, two of the acts, then the applicant, Helen and Geronimo, would get significant prospect of relief. I'll come to prospect in a second. But if that significant prospect, otherwise possible, is blocked by the judge, then in effect, instead of interpreting the Act of Parliament, the judge becomes the tool of the defendant to the application, which is what has happened. And this is the aspect the role of the judiciary as an agency of the state rather than as a separate part of the state, separation of powers, independence of the judiciary. If the judiciary then becomes part of the executive, then there is no redress against the executive. So it's not the fault of the existence of the law, even its limited kind of safety. It is the fault of the judiciary. Fault of the judiciary in that the judiciary member or members are being converted by the executive. So the head of the Ministry of Justice is the political head of the judiciary. And it is quite obvious that the head of the Ministry of Justice would have wanted DEFRA to prevail in the court, because a loss in a case by DEFRA is a loss not just for the DEFRA, the department, but of the entire government. And it's real and it's symbolic, because it has got implications across the departments and across the country. So politically, the executive has been sabotaging the independence of the judiciary and the existing, supposed to be existing independent legal remedies under the number of acts of parliament. The relief, the remedies that were supposed to be available to members of the public in the context of a particular decision or behavior by the particular department of the executive. So when the former solicitor, a woman called Mary Stacy, whose main practice took place in Birmingham, and she's a woman judge, and I'll come to that in a little while. Mary Stacy sat in judgment against Geronimo and against Helen MacDonald. And Helen MacDonald and Geronimo were represented by a woman that I had not heard of until this case, Catherine McGahey. She's a licensed lawyer, that is a barrister, and she's got silk, that is, she carries now the label QC, which confers on her the kind of entitlement to demand higher fees for her appearances or her work. Now, I have not yet come across the actual contents of the particular case in full, so I'll not comment on that part, but I have seen the ruling issued by the one called Murray and the one called Griffiths. Now, Griffiths is the one about whom third parties have said publicly that Griffiths is the judge who is almost openly an agent of the government. And Griffiths is the one that supports mass murders of animals. And the third party says that this is too bad that Griffiths was the judge against Geronimo and Helen in that particular case. So when Catherine McGahey represented Helen and Geronimo before Stacy. Stacy, according to news reports that I have seen, not the actual ruling, but the news reports that I have seen do contain some of the words attributed to Stacy herself. So when Stacy kind of made verbal comments in court or comments in the course of her role for DEFRA and against Helen MacDonald and Geronimo, Stacy, used offensive words and phrases. Stacy didn't give, going by the news reports that I've seen so far, as I keep saying, Stacy didn't recognize either the acts of parliament, the two acts of parliament that most relevant in the context. She didn't recognize the Human Rights Act, and she didn't recognize the Freedom of Information Act. Now, I don't know what Catherine McGahey said about those two acts, if she said anything. As I said, I haven't yet at this time read the actual quote ruling. I don't call it judgment because it wasn't a judgment. It wasn't impartial. It was not neutral. And it was not compliant with the legal obligations that the court was under. And I'll come to those after I deal with the prospect. Now, there is no explanation in the news references that I've seen so far as to what Stacy was meaning by her use of the word prospect against Helen MacDonald. What I have meant by prospect is that the two acts of parliament, the Human Rights Act and the Freedom of Information Act, the domestic acts of parliament in the UK, have enough provisions to allow Helen MacDonald to go ahead and lawfully demand all the information that she is seeking in defense of and in protection of Geronimo from the government as fronted by DEFRA. Now that is the bit that I haven't seen the kind of references to. Did Catherine McGahey, QC, refer to those two acts of parliament, or didn't she? If she did, then the utterance by Stacy that there was no prospect of success by the applicant, Helen MacDonald and Geronimo, was of course completely wrong, false, untruthful, because she was ignoring two valid acts of parliament being referred to by Helen MacDonald in her representation, by her representative. So, when Sebastian Payne writes another notebook the day after Chris Cook wrote his in the Financial Times, Sebastian Payne and Chris Cook actually complement in terms of the content, complement one another, because they are talking about The both of them are talking about the state dysfunctioning, because the motive, the context of Sebastian Payne's article that former prime ministers should be given a role is because of the crisis. And Sebastian Payne is referring to an agency, well, a kind of think tank called the Institute for Government. It's a woman called Hannah White. And both Sebastian Payne and Hannah White are avoiding democracy, avoiding democratic accountability, transparency, truthfulness, honesty, and compliance with the law. That is the law like the laws that Helen MacDonald has been entitled to but has been denied the benefit of by Mary Stacey. So the two pieces, one that Chris Cook wrote for the Financial Times yesterday, Tuesday the 31st of August 2021, and the piece that Sebastian Payne has written for today, Wednesday, Financial Times, there referring to government, referring to the work of Parliament. And Sebastian Payne is making a case, or trying to make a case, with the help of this woman, Hannah White, in the group called Institute of Government or Institute for Government, that former prime minister should be able to be encouraged to or being recruited to play these roles as experienced people. But there is no reference to what their role or position would be or had been while they were prime ministers in supporting violation of the law, the written law, in the words of Fawn Hall, or the unwritten law, that is common law, and the law of due process and rule of law. Because the universal function, the universal relevance of the rule of law, the doctrine, rule of law, is about the very purpose of the existence of a legal system, of the existence of the judiciary in a country. So whether Catherine McGahey went to any detail about the breaches, defiance of, violation of the requirements of the rule of law or due process, as was perpetrated by Mary Stacey, is not clear yet, because I have not seen the full kind of transcript of the actual proceedings. But regardless of whether I have seen it or not, the fact that Stacey ruled against everything that Helen MacDonald applied for is more than enough proof of where she went wrong. She was completely wrong, legally wrong? Because she was not applying the available acts of parliament and the available doctrine of the due process and rule of law to consider, legally consider, lawfully consider, truthfully consider, honestly consider, justly consider the evidence of Geronimo's health and the evidence of Defra's untruthful distortion and lies against Geronimo for 4 years. So this is Paul Mason's sleepwalking fascism, because Mary Stacey didn't hide her contempt for all these legal requirements that would have helped Helen and Geronimo, overwhelmingly helped them. And neither Sebastian Payne, who has kind of as an exhibition consulted the thing called Institute of Government, nor Chris Cook answered the criminality, illegality of the judiciary. So it's more than just Chris Cook's reference to what officials are doing in hiding diary entries about government ministers. It's about what they're doing to the legal rights of the individual. Chris Cook does mention court, but he mentions court and the role of the so-called civil servants in courts as actors who fake the evidence and kind of, when he didn't use the phrase, but what they do is they mesmerize. Government department employees, clerks, mesmerize most judges. And mesmerized, the judges then fail to even stay awake, to behave sensibly, with sense, which is what has been going on for the last 3 cases, in the cases that have been kind of defied and defeated and frustrated by Murray, Griffiths, and Stacey. These have been charades. These have not been legally, lawfully pursued and considered by the judges. They have been treated as occasions for the judiciary to abuse as part of the agenda, which has been consistently or persistently to rubber stamp what the government department, DEFRA, has itself been doing against the law. So when Mary Stacey said that Helen MacDonald didn't have a prospect of success, she wasn't talking objectively, neutrally. She was not saying subject to the evidence, the full evidence. She was saying, as we, the judges, have been behaving as deniers of any lawful legal rights on the part of the applicant, there is no prospect of us changing. That's what she was meaning. That's what she was meaning. So Geronimo, Justice for Geronimo, is our platform. It may be Helen's platform as well, but we fully kind of subscribe to the idea that Geronimo deserves full justice inside the UK and internationally. And what we are saying is that all the judicial options available to Geronimo and available to Helen MacDonald have yet to be, remember the word I'm using, tested, because they have not been tested yet. And when truthfully tested, honestly tested, neutrally tested, all these tests are bound to give a very, very clear result, exposing DEFRA and exposing the judges concerned as having violated the law and the legal obligations. That is what I'm saying. And I'm saying that based on the evidence, based on the law. Now, one of the things I've said earlier at the beginning is that in their peddling of the DEFRA kind of lies and untruths against Geronimo and Helen, the so-called Fleet Street newspapers have either chosen to ignore the international legal framework, or they have been acting as an agent of the government. And have furiously promoted the pack of lies that have been telling untruths against the whole personality and health of Geronimo, and the case and the claim based on the best health of Geronimo, the case claim as represented on behalf of Helen MacDonald. Now, Helen MacDonald is not an ordinary individual in the context of Geronimo. She just happens to be a trained veterinary nurse. I mean, I don't know the details of her knowledge, but I do know that she has knowledge that I don't have about the care and the health of animals, care for and health of animals, welfare of animals. So if, for example, somebody goes to an animal treatment center or the vets, and they come across one vet, that is veterinary surgeon, and one nurse, veterinary nurse, what would they do? The person who takes their pet animal for treatment or checkup, they would never start with the assumption that they should be looking at the state of health of the animal, rather than the nurse and the vet. People would, of course, allow the vet and the nurse to carry out the checking of the health, state of the health of the particular animal. So what gave DEFRA at any stage in the, or what has given DEFRA at any stage in the last 4 years, any reason to persistently say that an experienced, trained vet nurse like Helen doesn't know what she's talking about when she's saying that Geronimo is perfectly healthy, absolutely amazingly healthy, and he needs to be left alone, that he needs to be treated as a healthy Geronimo who needs no treatment. Why has DEFRA denied Helen, the veterinary nurse, this legitimate and absolutely perfect right? As he said about the Magna Carta of 1225 and Helen's statements in the media saying that she has been treated as if she was being punished for something. And then earlier she said that she was feeling tortured, going through the absolutely endless lies by DEFRA. The torture, what is the difference between Helen's feeling tortured and the tortures in terms of the international kind of references to regimes that do torture or have done torture? The detainees in Guantanamo Bay, or the two detainees, husband and wife, Belhaj and his wife. What's the difference in the feelings that Helen has been having, and the feelings that the detainees in a place like Guantanamo Bay, or the two detainees, husband and wife, that were betrayed by Jack Straw, the UK state, while Belhaj and his wife were being tortured in front of the British spies in Libya and on the planes on the way from the two Southeast Asian countries. Although they were married, the husband and wife were picked up by the CIA from two Southeast Asian countries. Now, although the headline, as I said in the Financial Times, is a promotion for the former prime ministers, this piece, byline to Sebastian Payne, is in fact a confession that Boris Johnson fronted government is not functioning. So Sebastian Payne is praising the interventions made by Theresa May as having resonated, that is to say, that it had an impact on the other MPs. That's Sebastian Payne. But let's go back to what I was saying at the beginning of this particular edition. There is no opposition, there is a shadow of the current government. Now, whether Blair, Blair, Gordon Brown, John Major, or Tony Blair, whether they are brought back to playing roles as former prime ministers, that remains to be seen. But currently, what is certain is that the person who is supposed to be holding the government, the executive, politically to account is the person who is the leader of the opposition, supposed to be. He's supposed to be leader of the opposition, but actually he is called the shadow prime minister, in effect. And his cabinet, shadow cabinet, not the opposition cabinet. So when a fascist decision or a series of fascistic decisions are made by the executive, the current executive, that is fronted at Downing Street level by Boris Johnson, when fascistic decisions are made violating the rights of the innocent members of society, of the electorate, of the population, the role of the leader of the opposition is supposed to be uphold the rights of the victims of injustice, unjust decisions by the executive. So is that happening? The answer is no. Although he is the leader of the opposition, he is not delivering the role that he is holding the post for in the kind of appearances. If an injustice is done to a British person or a person legitimately living in society, and the leader of the opposition is in a position to give an opinion, what do they do? What should they do objectively, fairly, reasonably, accountably, and without bias? They should be telling the truth, and they should be saying, let's look at the evidence and let's look at the law. So we shall be